My name is Birgit Schneider. I'm living in Berlin, Germany, and I'm a cultural and media scholar researching climate change, images and imaginaries in science and culture at Potsdam University. The reason for the following interview is the pressing question of what we can do better or maybe completely differently in climate change communication. And to discuss this question, we invited several speakers. And it was important to us to invite different voices from many fields of studies and also from different countries. And my guest for this interview is Maximilian Hepach. He studied philosophy in Vienna and Germany, Freiburg, and he is currently a fellow at the Cambridge Department of Geography in the United Kingdom. His main interests lie in the phenomenology of weather and climate. So he set out on the rare combination of philosophy with anthropology and human geography. Hello, Maximilian.
Hello, Birgit.
I would like to start with the example you also start your impulse paper with. And so many people say that in Germany and also in other countries in Europe, the exceptionally hot and dry summer of the year 2018 was the wake-up call that triggered climate activism. And the students' movement, Fridays for Future, began to demonstrate at that time. And I would also say that what we felt and experienced at that time on our own bodies felt in an eerie way no longer normal. Can we feel climate change, or in what way can we feel climate change?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, it's a very, very good and complicated question. I think more complicated than it at first may seem. As you said, I take the wildfires in Europe since 2015 to be a kind of starting point of an increased awareness of climate change, especially in Europe. And I find it interesting that although these events are thought of climate change events, if you go and look at what scientists and politicians and activists actually say is, well, clearly they are kind of signs of climate change. They point to what climate change might be or could be. They are kind of signals of what the future of climate change could look like. But most people fall short of saying, well, these are actually experiences of climate change, because the common dichotomy goes, weather can be experienced, whereas climate change cannot be experienced. Well, I guess it's borrowed from a kind of scientific imaginary where climate is thought to be this abstract concept, which we arrive at by abstracting from everyday weather, averaging it, talking about it more in terms of expectations, whereas weather is something we experience immediately. And what I'm interested in my research is looking at that tension between, as you just mentioned, the weather we are experiencing and the climate we are supposedly not experiencing, that dichotomy is slowly eroding as we are experiencing what some people call weird weather. So weather that isn't quite normal weather, as you were saying, but rather seems to unsettle something that might be climate, although in a different sense than we usually talk about climate.
In the last years, I found many cartoons also making the same point. For example, one cartoon, you have two panels, and in one you can read, "The continuous cold weeks are local weather and do not disprove global warming." And then the next frame, it has summertime weather, and you have the saying, "The continuous heat weeks are proof of global warming." And of course, this is also, for public understanding, this differentiation is very complicated. So at one time, cold weather is, why is a cold winter not a sign for global warming? And why is a hot summer always taken as a sign for global warming? So on this very basic level, it seems to be quite complicated. What would you react to this differentiation?
Yeah, I mean, that's again a quite difficult question. I would say that we should differentiate between proving or disproving climate change and thinking about what climate change would mean in experience. So clearly, no individual can prove climate change through their individual experience. If you experience a very hot winter or a very cold summer in Europe, or a very hot summer in Europe, that doesn't necessarily mean you have proven climate change, but nonetheless, the experiences you have can be articulated in ways which point to what climate change would mean to you in experience. It's not just whether you're experiencing, it is something more than that. And nothing speaks against then turning towards science and scientific inquiry in order to kind of check your intuitions. So maybe there's some confusion there between trying to prove climate change through experience, which we can't do, rather than turning towards climate change and experiences of climate change as moments in which we might understand what climate change can mean to us.
And of course, this differentiation is very rational. So weather is the here and now. This is something we perceive with our bodies. And on the other hand, nobody can feel statistics. So I cannot feel the global mean temperature or the German mean summer temperature. There's no moment for me to perceive this. If we insist on this idea that it's impossible to feel climate, maybe would you say we lose something for climate communication if we always say to the people, no, it's just the weather you experience outside there. This is not climate change. Leave climate change to the measurements and to the statistics and to the experts.
Yeah, I would certainly say that we lose a lot if we kind of take climate out of the realm of the things which are experientiable. I mean, your example of mean annual temperature is quite interesting. On the one hand, yes, we are unable to experience mean annual temperature, but on the other hand, almost all kind of cultural artifacts in a given place are or kind of take into account mean annual temperature. The way we build, the way we live, the way we dress, the things we eat to some extent are all somehow intertwined with the climate and essentially with the average temperature over certain periods of times. And as these average temperatures change, the unsettling thing is, well, it's not just some abstract metric which is changing, but it's kind of the very fabric of our reality, the very basis on which we have come to build our culture, which changes with it, which I think is why powerful studies which, for example, compare cities such as London and Barcelona, claiming that in the year 2050, the climate of London will resemble the climate of Barcelona. What's unsettling about that is not that London's temperature will just be higher or the humidity will be higher. What's unsettling is that you can imagine the whole infrastructure not being set up to cope with that change, and it taking a lot more from people than just it getting warmer or it getting more humid. So in that sense, I think emphasizing the experiential reality of climate change, as these examples with climate city analogs do, is a quite important strategy maybe, or quite an important way of elucidating the ways we are dependent on climate and the ways changes in climate affect us on an existential level.
We will need to talk about the cultural effects of climate and how the two are interlinked in a minute. You also quote Peter Rudyard Gold, who is an anthropologist. He 7 years ago, he wrote this paper, We Have Seen It With Our Own Eyes, Why We Disagree About Climate Change Visibility. And we could discuss the political position it takes if you disallow the climatic classification of an experience. So to disallow saying that this summer was unnormally, exceptionally hot, for example, or this drought is something which is related to climate change. He quotes Mike Hume, geographer at Cambridge at your university. No one can see climate change or feel it happening. So this would be, again, the scientific idea of climate change, and it's true. And then Alan Parker, an indigenous advocate, says in 2006 already, native nations of the Arctic and subarctic are already feeling catastrophic effects of warmer temperature. And then he adds a list of all these impacts. So what would it mean if we allow the classification of climatic experience to climatic weather experience? This is a paradox, it seems, to shape our realities, to shape our perceptions.
Yeah, I think it would certainly give people a stronger sense of agency when it comes to defining what it is they're experiencing. I think one interesting example of this are the now very popular weather attribution studies and the plans in future for every single extreme weather event to have a probability assessment which tells you how probable climate change has made this event, or how much more probable climate change has made this event, and hence in a way caused this event. And that's one of the ways in which we are trying to bridge this gap through scientific inquiry between climate as an abstract object as opposed to the weather we experience. And the way that's bridged, and this goes together with Rudyard Gould's idea of invisibilism, is by saying, well, yes, climate change remains invisible, but through this probability assessment, we are still able to, although it's invisible, we still have the authority to claim, well, these events you have experienced are actually caused by climate change. And if we were to reframe that in a way from the point of view of experience and not from the point of view of climate science, we could say, well, having that information, knowing it's more likely due to global warming that these events are more extreme or have increased in frequency, gives our experiences of these events a greater purchase. They're not just weather, they're actually experiences of climate change, although in a different way than it's framed or used by climate science.
Mm-hmm. And what does your perspective of phenomenology add to these perceptions? So what is specific about your take on weather and climate? How would you frame these events?
Yeah, I would say, what phenomenology helps us do is questions starting from the other side of the problem. Clearly, the issue with identifying climate and talking about experiences of climate change is that climate isn't an easy object of perception. Climate isn't an object which we can point to. It's not, Mike Hume, for example, writes, climate is everywhere and yet nowhere. It seems to occupy all spaces at all times. And yet, as he writes, you can't take me to see climate. It escapes immediate perception. And what phenomenology as a philosophical discipline does is it gives us the concepts to account for things which escape immediate perception. And examples in phenomenology include, for example, being embodied as one experience which can't really be described by pointing to an object, but rather describing the ways in which our embodied experience is given to us. And what I would like to argue is that in a similar way, climate change isn't a clear object of perception, nor is it something that is merely in our heads or something we kind of project into reality. But phenomenology allows us to understand climate as something which lies between subject and object, as a kind of mediating force which affords subject and object to be in distinct ways.
I would like to maybe draw the attention now to this idea of moods and feelings. I just had I heard a TED talk by meteorologist Marshall Shepard from the US, and he drew an interesting analogy to explain the difference of weather and climate. He said weather is your mood and climate is your personality. How are atmosphere, mood, perception, and climate and weather intertwined? So what ideas do you have about this very holistic approach?
Yeah, that's a very big question. I would say there's a difficulty in approaching climate from a philosophical or phenomenological approach, in that where do you, and this is a problem which already appears in Plato's dialogues, where do you, what are the joints of climate where you start to cut out the concept of climate? Where does climate begin and where does climate stop? And we were talking about climate change a minute ago. And I think what most people associate with climate change is, well, it's a kind of natural phenomenon. And phenomenology can certainly help us explain these types of phenomena, and point to how physical phenomena shape our perception, experiences, and our ways of inhabiting space and place in certain ways. That being said, phenomenology can then also go on to maybe draw out more general or abstract characteristics that I might call the climatic, which don't neatly fit onto what we call climate usually in everyday language when you talk about climate and climate change, but that in a way, the way kind of climate is all encompassing and it colors and affects both subject and object in perception. Climate has that in common with, as you just noted, with moods, with affects, with atmospheres. And I think what phenomenology can help do is to show how these things aren't neatly separated, parceled parts of reality. It's not like we have physical natural climate here, affects here, moods here, but rather that all of these share an experiential reality. And phenomenology can show the structures which allow us to account for these things in an interconnected way. Non-European approaches to climate and climate change, such as the work of Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro and his concept of fudo, highlights exactly this aspect, that if you look at the experiential reality of climate, it's impossible to disentangle the physical characteristics of a certain place with the kind of moods or attuned atmospheres that these places create. That's not to say that climate determines you. It's not to say that you're just a product of a climate, but it does mean that, and this is a broader phenomenological point, it's always very problematic to separate out in experience the physical from the emotional, the subjective from the objective. What the phenomenologist might say is that all of these are always given together, what the phenomenologist would call correlated. And in order to give a good account of climate, or an account of climate maybe that speaks to what people experience, you have to take into account the way these things are actually interconnected, as opposed to treating them as this is just what you're experiencing and this is the true scientific reality of climate change.
Is this going against the modern idea that we are independent and of climate? Because climate determinism, of course, is something we reject, and it got clear that this is not the same thing as what you explained a minute ago. So it's intertwined, it's entangled. We are living in a climate, and the climate shapes us in a way which still leaves a lot of freedom. But then again, if we think certain lives, cultures in this entanglement of climate change, what does this mean for culture? What ideas do you come up with your phenomenological approach to relate climate and culture? Because I think climate change, it is clear it will be a cultural change, and maybe this is a link we can draw.
Yes, certainly. I think again that Watsuji Tetsuro's concept of fudo is quite helpful in understanding the relation between nature and culture here. I think people are quite sensitive to environmental determinism and to climate determinism, and rightly so. And people may misread, or I would say might misread, Watsuji's work to be suggesting, well, climate shapes people in certain ways, determines them, and all that's left for humans to do is to make use of the possibilities a certain climate and a certain area affords them. But Watsuji also emphasizes the other side of that coin, namely that it's not just that we as individuals or as communities discover possibilities in landscape and climate, but it's also that, in a way, becoming sensitive to the way climate shapes us and the ways we might be differently shaped by different climates reveals something about the possibilities we have. Climate is kind of a medium of self-discovery in a way, which doesn't really determine us in a certain respect, but actually points to the multiplicity of ways in which we might be able to live with different climates and different as individuals and as communities. The issue with climate change and culture then, and Mike Hume makes this point as well, he outlines 3 different ways we might deal with changing climates. He says, on the one hand, given that if one goes along with Mike Hume's idea that climate as a concept stabilizes the relationship between weather and culture, then maybe because we're now influencing the climate culturally through our emissions, that distinction dissolves, and as Mike Hume writes, maybe the anthropogenic future is climateless because there's no medium anymore which mediates between weather and culture, no stabilizing force. The second option Mike Hume suggests is we might try to resecure climate. We might try to kind of keep our cultures permanent by using geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, climate change adaptations and mitigations in order to resecure a reality which is becoming more and more unsustainable. And this might be something that Amitav Ghosh would call being deranged in a sense. Whereas the third option Mike Hume points to, and I think this goes together well with the ideas of what Suji I just briefly highlighted, is to think of future climates as possible moments of improvisation, thinking of not trying to kind of in a almost reactionary frame of mind cling to a climate reality that we may no longer be able to save and that we shouldn't save at all costs, but to consider the ways we can creatively engage with changes in climate and the corresponding changes in culture, and seeing those opportunities as well to address the inequalities, because in the end it's not climate, I mean in a way it is, but it's not truly climate which will be devastating. It's the unequal ways in which that devastation is then distributed across different communities and areas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So thinking about or allowing to talk about climate impacts or weather as a climate impact, and also the changing of landscapes, forest fires, deserts, droughts, etc., could also be seen as impacts of climate, and of course we can see them and we can feel them. So this also helps to maybe raise sensibilities. Would you say that? So if we get more sensible to the changing environments on a very bodily level, not only on the level of the body, we could also talk about farmers who started to adapting to the new seasons by changing the dates to plant. In Germany, it's grain or winter wheat. I think they already changed the times of the year dramatically. So what do we gain if we get more sensible to these weather events, to these eerie weather events? For all these ideas of how this climate change is also a cultural challenge.
Yeah, I think that, and this might go back to a point we were talking about earlier, that I think it gives people more agency in talking about the way they're experiencing and the way they might react or take climate change into account. It's not that something abstract happens and then we have to find some kind of technological solution in order to stop it, but it's, I think thinking about climate change as a cultural phenomenon and as something which is given in everyday experience highlights the fact that changes in climate will necessitate changes in ways of life, and those are not changes that someone will decide for us. I guess in the best case it would be something you would arrive at in a communal way. Yes, so I would say looking at climate change culturally might be a way of addressing the danger of looking at climate change as a kind of technocratic problem, which is then solved with technocratic solutions, as opposed to integrating into the solution or into the approaches to climate change aspects which are important to us in everyday life, be it the farmer or the city dweller.
And I have one more thing I would like to talk about, because still, okay, with our bodies, it's the here and now is the weather, and it's related to climate in intrinsic ways, but We could also think of our bodies as climate archives. For example, if we have experienced more than 40 or 60 or even 80 winters and summers and seasons changing in the temperate zones, for example, we know how different winters felt. And we remember skating on the ice, white Christmas, cold winters, etc. So, I mean, this is also, is this something you can also address with phenomenology on this long-term idea of perception? So I'm a climate archive, I can remember all these traces of seasons with my body?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I think a phenomenologist would say, I mean, I can't speak for every phenomenologist, but I would say as a phenomenologist maybe that you can't disentangle different modes of perception and experience from one another. You can't disentangle perception from memory. You can't disentangle memory from imagination. They are all interrelated in different ways and they inform each other in different ways. And in much the same way, I would argue climate as an experiential reality is entangled with all of these different ways in which we experience things. So, as you say, the way climate might have inscribed itself into our body and into our memories, into our expectations, shapes these experiences in distinct ways. And what phenomenology allows us to do is to think about, it kind of solves the difficulty of understanding how this works. Because in a way you could say, well, how is it exactly that climate change, this thing out there, has an influence on all these different aspects of our experience, on our memory, our imagination, our perception. And what phenomenology allows us to argue or to point out is that, well, it's not that complicated if you don't start from the assumption that these things are separate, but rather start from the assumption that these things are entangled, and that in much the same way as perception is mediated through climates, given that climate affords certain ways that we and things exist in the world around us, in the same way climate is entangled with other modes of experience such as memory and imagination, just to name two examples. So it would maybe give further credibility to the idea that individuals and individual climate archives are authorities in their own right of the experiential reality of climate and its changes.
I would like to ask, is there an example or a situation, an object you study which is telling about this feeling climate question? Is there something you would like to highlight?
Yeah, well, I think this is what makes climate a kind of complicated object to study, because it's difficult to find one example which would be kind of exemplary of climate. I mean, it's in the very nature of climate to be difficult to grasp, to be everywhere and nowhere. I would say what I trace in my research is the way that thinking about climate phenomenologically sensitizes us to the way climate is an object in our everyday experience. In a way, it doesn't really take a big example to become aware of the way we experience climate or experience climate change. Actually, once you sensitize yourself a bit to the way that your climate affords your way of living, your moods, as we were talking about earlier, you come to discover climate slowly in every aspect of daily life, the way you plan out weeks and months to come. And for me personally, I think traveling has become a very different experience, traveling to different countries. And by now, I think one of the first experiences I have is leaving a train, for example, in a new city, if you've traveled for quite a while, and then having to adjust for a moment and realizing, well, actually, this place, these atmospheres afford a very different way of being. And a second empirical example of climates, which I won't go into much detail now, but are the ways we build structures in order to account for climate. So the way certain architectures are constructed in order to take climate into account, the way we air condition spaces, these are also good examples where, in a way, climate gets a material shape, because we are in trying to enclose ourselves we have to take into account what lies outside of these enclosures, and hence you can then use certain architectural structures, buildings, homes, in order to reflect on the ways in which climate appears as a material object in the ways in which we try to live with climate.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your ideas and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.